Good afternoon. My name is Kojo Idrissa, and thank you for coming to the afternoon keynote. I will be your speaker. My talk is called Python and the Warmth of Other Suns. The title of the talk is based on a book called The Warmth of Other Suns, which is about the great migration of African Americans from the southern part of the United States to the northern part of the United States that happened from 1915 to 1970. That migration is basically the history of my family. But the title also makes sense in the context of the talk, as we'll see as we go on. So let's move forward. So who am I? As you can see here, I'm a software engineer at a company called RevSys. I work mostly in Python and Django. I am involved in a lot of different community activities, largely in the Django community in the US and some internationally. I've also led the orientation for PyCon US since 2022. As a result of these activities and in other community involvement, I've been able to meet a wide range of Python and Django developers from all over the world, and that has helped inform my thinking on a lot of different issues. So as the DEFNA North American ambassador, as you saw, DEFNA is the nonprofit that puts on DjangoCon US, and I would be remiss if I did not invite you all to attend DjangoCon US. I understand the US is far away, but we do have virtual tickets that are available. DjangoCon US is from October 16th to the 20th of this year. Physically is happening in Durham, North Carolina, but there are virtual tickets, that are available. So it would be wonderful to see as many of you there as possible. So a little more on who I am and why I'm here. So I realize I'm just showing slides here, but there are plenty of pictures and videos of me on the internet. I am African American, but part of being African American is generally not knowing where in Africa your ancestors are from. I am also an African American who thinks of myself as an African person from America. But since most of us don't know where our ancestors are, not all African Americans think of themselves this way. But since I do, I make an effort to try to think of Africa and the issues that it faces as I explore the global Python and Django communities. Hopefully, I'll have some useful ideas for you based on that. I'm also someone who changed careers, so I didn't get a computer science degree. I got an accounting degree and an MBA and worked in business and in teaching for a long time. But then another one of the reasons that I was so pleased to be invited to speak here at PyCon Uganda, especially the very first PyCon Uganda, was that in 2016 at DjangoCon US, I met Emily Karungi, who is from Uganda, but who has also helped mentor other Ugandan developers. And I had a chance to meet at least one of her mentees at PyCon US in 2023 in Salt Lake City. So I was very pleased to be invited to speak to the very first PyCon Uganda. So we talked about me changing careers. So what did I do before? And I bring this up because this has helped inform some of my thinking that I'll present in this talk. So before I was an accountant, I got an MBA. I will often joke with people that I'm professionally trained in capitalism, but that professional training in capitalism helps inform a lot of my thoughts on this talk. I also lived in China for 2.5 years, teaching for an Australian university, an Australian-Chinese joint venture university. And that combination of living outside of my home country and living in a different country, but also working for a university that was based in a third country gave me some broader exposure as far as seeing things outside of the normal lens of what I was accustomed to from life in the United States. And again, we'll see those ideas as we go forward. So here are the basic ideas of my talk. I've got sort of these 3 bullet points here. The rest of the talk will go into more detail about why I feel this way, how I reach these conclusions, and provide some examples of what I mean about some of these things. Developer experience, Africa's history, providing a unique problem set, and how sometimes the US and EU models may not be the best to follow for regions that aren't the US or the EU. So one of the fundamental points of this talk is this difference between a senior developer and a junior developer, and it is problem exposure. That's the main difference. A senior developer is simply a junior developer who has seen more problems or been exposed to a larger number of problems or a wider type of problem and has had to bump their head against them and had to figure out how to solve them. This is the primary difference, just problem exposure. And so now it's time for a story about problem exposure. So this is about the first serious Python project that I built. As I said, in my former career, I was an accountant. In my final accounting job, I used Python to automate a task that was being done manually in Excel. And it took 8 to 9 hours to do. If you ever used Excel, there's something called a pivot table, and you can filter lots of data. So there's a lot of filter, copy, paste, filter, copy, paste. And there was 8 or 9 hours of that. I was able to, I learned enough Python at that point. I found a library to help me work with the Excel file. And I was able to take that task and turn it into something that took at most 1 to 2 hours, but most of the work actually happened in under 2 minutes. Then based on that, on getting that to work, I presented that solution at a local meetup, and then I ended up giving that talk at various conferences in my home, in the state that I live in of Texas, but also in other cities and also in other countries. And I bring this up, I use this as an example, as an example, because I think this talk was accepted and it was novel because when you looked at other professional developers, it was a problem many of them hadn't really seen before or didn't actually have to deal with. It wasn't something that most professional developers had to deal with. It was an accounting problem, and I was an accountant. And so that problem exposure, having that unusual problem set gave me this new solution that other developers hadn't really seen or hadn't had to deal with before. And that brings me back to this main point number one. Again, developer experience and seniority is based on the problems that they've seen and the problems that they've had to solve. So the question that raised in my mind, or for the purposes of this talk, is what are the types of problems that developers see in different regions? And as you move from one city to another in the same country, from one country to another on the same continent, from one continent to another, you've got different problems that come up, and they're based on the history and the context and the development of that specific region. But that's the main point number one, this idea of problem exposure. So another story, a slightly longer story, what you see here on the slide is basically Chinese American cell phones. And this is about my time living in China and a problem that I had to encounter. And the difference between voicemail and texting on cell phones in the US and in China. So I lived in China for 2.5 years. When I first moved to China, on my first trip, I got a cell phone. I came back. It was a short trip. I went back to China and stayed for 2.5 years. And as I was looking to get another cell phone while I was there, I asked them about being able to get voicemail on my cell phone. And the people there looked at me strangely, like, A, why would you want that? And B, like, well, no, we don't have that. That's not an option. And so they were just sort of confused, and I was confused as to why it was so difficult. It turns out that voicemail on cell phones in the U.S. is a byproduct of the U.S. development, the developmental history of the United States. So if we step back through time, voicemail on cell phones now is because in the United States, we've had nearly ubiquitous landline saturation. And so since maybe the 1950s or earlier, almost every home or a large percentage of homes in the US had landline telephones. And so those landline telephones led to people getting answering machines, which were just a tape recorder connected to the phone so that you could record messages from people if people called when you weren't home. Answering machines then led to voicemail being offered by the phone companies to be more efficient than just tape recorders connected to the phones. And then when cellular phones became readily available to most Americans, they offered voicemail as a service because that's what the United States customers were accustomed to. They were accustomed to having a voicemail service. Now, we compared that to China, where I was living, and the landline saturation in China was nowhere near what it was in the United States. So when cellular phones and mobile phones became popular, they just sort of leapfrogged that. So now, and I lived in China in 2005, from 2005 to 2007, at that point, almost everyone had a cell phone. And so they just sort of jumped over the landline phone and didn't even go to that. And so without that multi-decade history of landline phones and answering machines, voicemail just hadn't become a thing, and most people didn't know about it, or people knew about it, but no one cared. It wasn't a thing people had been using for 20 or 30 years. And so for me, it was a little confusing until I thought about it and realized, oh, we have these developmental differences. And so one of the benefits of my life in China is that it let me not only see new problems in a different place, but it also let me see the problems from my home country in a different way. And, it allowed me to realize that the things that I thought were universal norms weren't really universal at all. They just turned out to be local customs based on the local history of where I was from. So I pointed out earlier that I was the definite North American ambassador on one of my earlier slides. In that role, I have traveled around a lot of North America and to some other countries. Definite, again, being the nonprofit that puts on DjangoCon US. But that travel has allowed me to see a wider range of problems than I might have normally seen. It also has allowed me to meet a lot of developers from outside of the US, and those friendships and relationships have given me insight into how their context and their problem sets are different from the ones that I encounter at home. So this brings me to main point number 2, this open source software centers. Currently, open source software communities and their cultures are physically and culturally centered in the US and Europe. And what that means is many of the solutions and patterns are based on the context and histories of those two regions, the US and the EU. And culturally, the US is very, very Eurocentric on its own. So the challenge that this presents is that we know that with software isn't always just portable between operating systems or hardware. You can't just take an iOS app and run it on an Android device. You can't just always take a Linux app and run it on Windows or run it on a Mac. In that same way, a lot of these patterns and approaches to software development or to problem solving, those patterns aren't always portable between regions. And so I'll take a look at a couple of examples of that. So the first example I'll look at, another short story, is about this idea of tatami mats in the United States. So this happened in the US after World War II. If you are not familiar, tatami mats are the straw mats that you will often see in, if you have been to Japan, you might see them. They're often used in Japanese homes as flooring, to the point where Japanese homes are often described by the number of tatami mats as opposed to like square meters. They're often described as like 3 tatami mats or 5 tatami mats or that sort of thing. And so U.S. soldiers saw these tatami mats during World War II when they were in Japan and thought that they were nice looking. And so they would try to bring them home to the U.S. and start putting them in U.S. homes. The problem is the tatami mats that were used in the U.S. very, very quickly became dirty or damaged or destroyed. The reason for that is, again, you've taken a solution from one context and try to bring it to another context. In the US, we generally don't take our shoes off when we come inside. In Japan, almost everyone takes their shoes off when they come inside, when they come into a home. In almost every Japanese home or apartment or residential space, when you walk in, there's a dedicated area just inside the door that is lower than the rest of the living space that is designed for you to take your shoes off and store your shoes, and then you step up into the house. So tatami mats work very well in Japan where no one's walking around with shoes inside. But in the United States, there was dirt being packed in, the shoes would damage the tatami mats. Women wearing high heels of any sort would punch holes through the straw mats. So again, this is an example of taking a solution from one context and just trying to drop it into another context and it not working out at all. So another example problem, and this is something that I've run into based on conversations with friends and from some of my own experiences, OCE web applications. So OCE is short for Oceania, which is the continent that includes Australia and New Zealand and Polynesia. And that part of the world is just, for lack of a better term, physically distant from everything else, from most other continents and parts of the world. And as a result, the ping times to and from OCE to other parts of the world are longer. And since the internet connections there aren't as strong, the internet, especially say within Australia, tends to be slower than what you might see in the US or in the EU. But US and EU developers tend to overlook these details because they don't live in that context, whereas OCE web developers have to deal with it because that's the context that they live in. And so if we take a look at, we sort of combine those 2 points above about problem exposure and the sort of the US EU centric nature of the open source community, combining those with my own experiences and some of my own training, I've sort of developed this theory that I've been thinking about for a while. So here's my hypothesis. Part one of my hypothesis is that Africa, both as a continent and as individual countries, has individual problem sets that are different from the United States and from the EU. Part two is that if expertise and experience are functions of problem exposure and resolution, these local contexts become almost natural resources for developing new expertise and solutions, because these are problem sets that aren't available to most other people. Part three is that if you're developing local solutions, that work can and should be done in local languages. This makes it easier to share those solutions locally, so that even if English is the official language in a particular country, in here we're at PyCon Uganda, so talking about Uganda, communicating your development work or sharing it in Luganda or in Swahili is important. And then part four, the advantages of solving local problems are threefold. You get three benefits at once. First, you've solved a local problem, which is important and helpful. Second, you develop a local expertise, so local software development expertise in your local region, which is also important and valuable. And then third, you can end up providing a potential new global solution that couldn't be seen by others outside of the region because they didn't face that problem. They weren't exposed to that particular problem. And so here we get to the sort of the subtitle of the talk. As I said before, the United States and the European Union, along with their cultures and contexts, are similar to two suns that most of the open source world orbits, or two suns that they orbit, or the gravitational fields sort of pull in everyone. And again, as I pointed out, a lot of the US culture is very Eurocentric, so there's a lot of similarities. Even though you've got two different suns, you've got a lot of similarities back and forth there. Many aspects of open source development and culture orbit these regions, and as a result, these practices are often reflections of the national and regional cultures and contexts of those two suns. And when I talk about these contexts of these two regions, the contexts include the economic development of those regions and the infrastructure development of those regions. And so again, like when we talk about the example of, say, web applications in OCE, there's a different level of infrastructure for internet speed and traffic in OCE than what you have in the US or in the EU or in other parts of the world. Also different levels of economic development across different, in the US, which has currently the world's largest economy, that might be changing soon. And then in the EU as well, a very different economic context there compared to Africa or to other parts of the world. And so when we look at this, Africa has many different countries, each with its own unique problem set based on its own historical context. Now, these are problems that people outside of the continent never get exposed to, or people outside of that specific country never get exposed to. So some of the issues that are happening in Uganda are different from what's happening in Nigeria or in Ghana or in Botswana. And so since people outside of that region never get exposed to those problems, they never learn to solve them. And again, going back to this idea that the difference between a senior and a junior developer is problem exposure. So my theory is that with over 50 countries and over 1 billion people, Africa can become at least one other sun, if not multiple suns, in the open source world, with African developers building solutions to problems that only they encounter and only they have a strong understanding of. So here's the bad news. I wish I could, sit here and tell you all, oh, well, here are the top 10 things that Ugandan Pythonistas should be working on. But I don't. I don't have a list like that, and I don't know because I'm not there. I don't live in Uganda. I don't live on the continent. What I would say is, as you hear talks throughout the conference, try to think of local problems that you could solve with that knowledge, as well as how you can use it in the global marketplace. And I'll talk a little bit more about the global marketplace later, but I understand people often want to try to build their development skills so they can do things on a global scale. But as I was looking through the schedule of talks, I've already seen some talks on the schedule that just jumped out at me as far as, oh, these would be great for helping to solve local problems. There were talks earlier today on developing IoT applications with Python microcontrollers. There was a talk on called Introduction to Data Science with Python, Unleashing the Power of Data. And another talk, Python Custom Visuals and Power BI, unleashing the power of data visualization. So just in looking at those 3 talks, I can see how each of those could be used to solve problems, regardless of where you are, to help provide solutions for your specific local situation. So I would say that as you take a look at the rest of the schedule for the rest of the conference, try to look at it through this lens and keep this thought in mind of, okay, how could I use what I'm hearing in this talk or what I'm learning from this speaker to solve a problem, whether it be in Kampala or in your neighborhood in Kampala or in other parts of Uganda or from other parts of Africa for people who are attending from other parts of Africa. But let me make this reminder about using Python to solve problems. There's something that I call the Python use spectrum. And if you want to hear more about this, I've done an entire talk about this at PyGotham in 2019. This is the title of the talk that you're seeing on the slide. You can put that into YouTube and you can find the talk. But the summary is there are a lot of different ways to use Python. Then there's a difference between using Python to solve problems versus using Python to become a professional software developer. They're 2 different use cases. You don't have to become a professional software developer to use Python to solve problems. Python is an excellent tool for building solutions to all sorts of problems. You don't have to make software engineering your primary career to do useful things with Python. So again, as I spoke about some of the other talks that happened earlier in the day, you can take a look at those and look at other talks going forward in the conference. You can combine Python with your knowledge of another domain and let it help you. As I pointed out earlier, I built my accounting solution 3.5 years actually before I got my first developer job and before I had ever given any sort of a presentation about Python. And so I was nowhere near a professional Python developer or a software engineer. I was someone who had learned Python and understood a specific problem set and used Python to solve that problem. So I think it's important to keep in mind that you can choose your own path, but the issue of problem exposure remains the same. You can build your own expertise and make yourself a more experienced developer by looking at the problems that you have around you and then working on using Python to solve those in as much as you can. And again, as I said, the title of the talk, if you want to look for it on YouTube, is there, where I go into it in more detail. And so let me address this reality. And I sort of alluded to this before, but I understand that people often get into software development so that they can have better career opportunities and better economic opportunities. And that there's often much more money to be made working in the US or in the EU or working for companies that are based in those places. If I go back to the metaphor of multiple suns, I know that those suns, quote unquote, are often warmer than where you may be at the moment. And I know it's easy for myself as an American to say, go African developers, go Ugandans, and build these local solutions, while I'm living under the warmest of suns in the richest country in the history of the world. So why do I feel that a message like this is worth sharing or worth giving? In my mind, it comes back to building expertise. So while you're building your skills, the problems around your local sun, quote unquote, can expose you to problems that other people simply can't see because they don't have access to those problems. They don't live in those contexts. You can also help support the growth of people around you in your local area who have no intention, desire, or ability to move to another region or to orbit another sun. And even if you decide to move to another region or to another area, you can continue to contribute to the strength of your local developer community, even if you move somewhere else. Again, I know I mentioned before, having met Emily Karungi, I know she's not living, I don't believe she's living in Uganda anymore, but I know she still has contact with and impact on people in Uganda. So that is a reality. And another reality is neocolonialism. So the idea of building local expertise to solve local problems, in my mind, is preferable to a neocolonial approach of having developers from outside of Africa or from outside of Uganda come into Africa to try to build solutions to problems, because one, they may not fully understand those problems or the context in which those problems exist. And so the quality or the applicability of the solutions is questionable. But also, unfortunately, if history has taught us anything, solutions that are built by neocolonialists or old school colonialists generally benefit the colonizer and not the local people. So I think it's going to be more beneficial for local problems to be solved by local people, and that also helps to build local expertise. Now, the caveat here is I might be wrong. I am, as I say, I'm an African person, but I'm not from Africa. I've only actually visited Africa once, so I might not know what I'm talking about here. I could actually be the problem. I might be a case of, oh, well, this American man is trying to tell African people what they should be doing and how they should be doing it. I hope that's not the case, but I felt it was important to include that caveat. I am not an all-knowing source of knowledge, but there is one thing that I'm entirely sure of, and that is that there are these limits of vision. Most people have trouble seeing beyond what we think of as normal, or even seeing past our own pain. So one of the reasons I've mentioned a lot of these things in my past, in my travels and living abroad and that sort of thing, is because I've made an effort to try to use my experiences to help me see that what I think of as normal isn't universally normal. For better or for worse, mostly for worse, this is one of the great failings of American culture. We have a tendency to think that we are the center of the universe and that we have invented everything and that the way we do things is the universal norm. And so, again, I've tried to use my experiences to help me see that, what I've grown up as thinking of as normal isn't universally normal. It's only normal where I live, and it's normal where I live because of the history of where I live. So these so-called normal things that work for me at home don't always work in other places. And I have learned that firsthand by traveling to other places and running into issues. So with that in mind, it's important to realize that solutions and patterns that are developed in one region might not be as useful or as applicable in another region. So with the open source world being centered on the US and EU, some solutions and patterns developed there might not be viable in Africa or might not be as beneficial to Africa. So in conclusion, again, I'll sort of reiterate my main points. Developers become more experienced by being exposed to and having to solve different types of problems. 2, Africa itself, again, as a continent overall and different regions within Africa, as well as the individual countries within Africa, each present a set of problems that aren't commonly seen in an open source world that is centered around the US and the EU. So Africa has this unique problem set that generally isn't seen by the rest of the world. These problems, or this unique problem set, represents an intellectual natural resource that can help African developers build expertise that is rare or even unique in the global community. And I think that making use of this resource can help Africa not only resolve local problems, and again, when I say help Africa, it's an entire continent, things have to be done country by country, city by city, but I think this resource can be used to help resolve local problems while also becoming at least another son or multiple other sons in the global open source community. So this is the end of my talk. I'm very interested in hearing feedback from people. Here you can see my Twitter handle and my Mastodon address. This talk is pre-recorded, but I am online now. So 1600 Kampala time in the afternoon, what we would say 4 p.m. is 8 a.m. Houston time. So I'm online now as you all are watching/listening to this. And so if people want to reach out to me on Twitter or on Mastodon, I will also be watching these 2 hashtags for the conference here throughout the rest of the day and throughout the rest of the conference. So I look forward to hearing from people and hearing feedback. And once again, thank you very much to the organizers of PyCon Uganda for inviting me to speak. And I hope that you all enjoy the rest of the conference and have a wonderful time.